remember in those days there was no video, so you were essentially just selling theatrical. Rarely, this material wouldn't play television in those days. There was really no pay television, there was no video, so it was really theatrical and there might be some trains, planes and automobiles or boats or army camps or things like that. But
Campuses.
It was essentially theatrical. So and that was with only, I suppose, 7 or 8 territories licensed. So we were pretty pleased about that. And then we came back to Australia and we got, I remember the first 35mm print arriving in Filmway's office at the Filmway's office at the Dendy Melbourne, coming in from MGM, and we sent it to censors. Then we had the first of our huge fight with dear old Mr. Prowse, the then chief censor, the one-armed bandit, who was quite difficult about things, and don't think he had ever really embraced the R certificate coming in. At that time also they had had state censorship as well, and Queensland was notorious for banning films that had been played elsewhere, and sometimes you could use it to your advantage and sometimes you couldn't. Anyway, we decided to open a week earlier in Queensland than we did anywhere else, and I think we opened, I don't know, maybe June 14, June 21, something like that, and we ran for 4 days, and then there was an executive order that we were banned, we were pulled off. So we made a huge PR bang about that. And then when we opened in Melbourne, I think 10 days later, we opened the Dendy Collins Street, which was the theatre that Robert and Mark put into the bottom of the what was then the Pan Am building. The film ran a year and a half. I think it took over $1 million in that one cinema. It never quite emulated the success in Melbourne for a variety of reasons. I'm not quite sure why. I think it had much to do with the fact that Filmways were very thick on the ground personnel-wise, media connections and what have you in Melbourne, because that's where they hailed from, and were less so in Sydney. We held off opening in Sydney until they opened what was then the Dendy Martin Place, and we opened at the Dendy Martin Place when they opened that, but it only ran about 3 months at the Dendy Martin Place, and then it became a perennial, really. I mean, it worked its way through drive-in double bills in Australia, drive-in triple bills, drive-in quadruple bills, midnight shows.
It sounds as though it was probably the most profitable single movie you were associated with.
Well, it possibly was on a cash-in, cash-out basis.
Yes.
I mean, we were in the first 12 movies that were released on video cassette in Australia by Walter Lenny when he opened his Video Classics. That was Phantasm was one of them, and well, it goes without saying it's never played free TV, but it has played pay TV a couple of times. So it was very, very, very successful, and by the time December came round, it's December '76, it was clear that, well, three or four things were clear. The first was I was never going to be a lawyer, because I had during that year 1976, I had the preceding year graduated from law, managed to do the equivalent of my articles sort of by zipping in and out for 2 or 3 months, and then actually went to the bar in Melbourne for like 2 months, sort of just, you know, making $1 or $2, doing a bit of, you know, crash and bash and, you know, family law stuff and stuff like that. Well, anyway, by Christmas, that was clear that I didn't want to do that. I was getting tremendous pressure put on me from the Filmways people to do a sequel to Phantasm. They wanted to do that, and they wanted, almost at the same time, they decided they wanted to set up a production company with me, somewhat similar to what Village had done with Hexing. So we did do a sequel, and I was always, I'm not talking with hindsight, I was ambivalent about it, because I felt that we had hit a moment of time with Phantasm where, much like in the States 2 or 3 years earlier, where something like, similar but different, Deep Throat had become a sort of a cultural phenomenon, and sort of middle-class people who would not normally be seen dead going to that sort of a movie popped in to see Deep Throat, and Phantasm was a sort of a similar phenomenon. The sort of the middle class, the sort of the people from Brighton and the people from, you know, Mosman and what have you, went to see it, and they went as a couple. They didn't sneak in, and it wasn't guys sneaking in raincoats. It was girls' night out. It was couples. It was I thought that was caused by the sort of the whole liberation of censorship at both in Australia at the film, television and literary level, and that, like every other sort of craze, that sort of mania we'd never go back to, you know, banning an Ingmar Bergman movie, but the interest in people just seeing sort of nudity or sexual content on the screen almost for the sake of it, because they'd simply never seen it, let alone, you know, learning to laugh at it or see it in a sort of amusing way or other things. I wasn't sure whether that was replicable. However, you know, when you've made a movie that's made that much money, it's hard, and people want to give you more money to make the sequel, it's hard to say no. So in this case, we started to put together Phantasm Comes Again, which was, as the name implies, or it was originally Phantasm 2, and then we thought Phantasm Comes Again was a better title. And this time the idea, instead of having the nutty professor, the idea was to have a reporter doing, you know, agony advice column, his last night on the job, and a sexy new young girl taking over the column, and they're reading letters and answering them, blah, blah, blah. So the gimmick was all right. The problem basically, there were two problems with it, well, there were three problems with it. The first was that we had more money. Now you would say, why was that a problem? But in this case it turned out to be a problem because it encouraged us to do what we hadn't done on the first one. On the first one, apart from the professor stuff with Bluthel, we didn't shoot at lip sync. We simply had a voiceover, and then we'd segue into just music over and some effects over the sex scenes. In the second one, we said, well, let's have them talking. Let's lip sync it. And of course, what we didn't realise was that these actors weren't all that great. They might have looked interesting, they might have looked fun, they might have been able to swing off the ceiling, but when it actually came to sort of putting 4 or 5 words together rather than, you know, groaning, you know, they sort of weren't up to it. So that was problem number one.
And you had the same cast.
We pretty much had the same cast. We had some cast. The second thing was that Richard didn't want to do it again, which was fine, because I liked, in that period of the 70s, my mantra was working with first-time directors. I wanted to do that. That was a sort of a Corman-esque thing, and I thought if I was going to sort of pursue the producer career, I wanted that to be in a sort of a mentoring fashion with
So Corman was still a kind of role model, quite an important
Well, he was
role model.
certainly somebody that I was looking at and seeing if there was a way to draw on that experience,
learn from him,
and deploy it into the Australian context. So the fact that Richard didn't want to do a sequel I didn't see that as a bad thing, but I guess what I also underestimated in about Richard and about the first film versus the second, and we wound up going with Colin Eggleston to do Phantasm Comes Again. And Colin, like Richard, had done work at Crawford's. He was an experienced guy. He'd worked with Vince Monton. He was capable of moving very, very quickly. All of the things that you needed, but he had either a very different sense of humour to Richard, or you could argue to some degree that perhaps he didn't have a sense of humour. And neither good nor bad, and it certainly wasn't a problem in Long Weekend, the film he did subsequently. But in this particular picture, where you somehow or other had to find a balance between the sex content and the sort of the wackiness and just push it to a certain degree, probably in retrospect, Colin was the wrong choice. But I can't lay too much blame on Colin, because the truth is that by the time we actually finished the movie, and we did it exactly a year later, we went out again on Christmas Eve '77, and we did the same routine, releasing it in June, July, having it at Cannes. Interestingly, the foreign sales were the same. We got no more or we got no less. We did exactly the same. The budget went up from the first film, the budget was 50, the Phantasm Comes Again, the budget was 75, 73, and we covered the budget from foreign. Where we didn't get, and the investors, apropos, the investors were the same people who, as you would expect, who'd invested in the first Phantasm, with the exception that this time Filmways came in, not just paying the blow up, but they actually came in as an investor, and so the additional 20-something thousand largely came from Filmways. So it was a minimum guarantee against receipts, as opposed to, coupled with an equity investment, as opposed to just paying a big chunk of money for the blow up from 16. We still shot on 16, so there was that component in pricing as well. But they came in, and at the end of the day, by the time we opened, the bloom had gone off, or the raincoats had gone back into the closet or whatever. So ultimately, we didn't lose money on that movie, which was good, because of the foreign sales. But we didn't make the huge
There was
killing.
no blue sky.
Well, there was no blue sky.